Okay, and let's get started. So, welcome everyone. My name is Naomi, and I work here at Bridge Lab at Stanford School of Medicine. I'm very excited to have you all here for this community discussion about school accommodations and children with RASopathies. And we'll just go over a few housekeeping notes, and then we will go ahead and get right to it. So, um, some housekeeping notes. The event is being recorded, as you probably heard when you jumped on, and we will share the recording with attendees after the session is over. We have 1 hour. The majority of it will be for questions and open discussion. When we get to the open discussion part, you're welcome to unmute yourself and we'll open it up to everyone. And then that part will be cut from the recording when we share it. So feel free to speak when we do that. And as I mentioned before, this is a community event. Please feel free to utilize the chat. We want to hear from you, and we want you to connect with one another. So if you would like, and if you're able to, feel free to do so in the chat. In terms of our agenda, we're going to do a little bit of welcome and quick introductions. Then we're going to go straight to the Q&A. A lot of you have sent us a lot of really, really great questions ahead of time. So we're going to go over those first, and then we'll open it up at the end for additional questions. If you have any additional questions while we're talking about anything, feel free to add them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. And with that, I am excited to introduce our panelists and speakers for today. We have Dr. Tamar Green here on the call, who earned her MD at Ben-Gurion University and is a child psychiatrist. She completed a 3-year postdoc fellowship in neuroscience at Stanford, and today she is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychiatry here at Stanford, and she's the PI, the principal investigator at Bridge Lab. Hi, Dr. Green, how are you?
Hey, good. So nice to see everyone here. Very excited to learn from Thayer.
Yeah, and our second panelist today is Thayer Gershon. She was a hospital school teacher for 27 years, so we are all very excited to hear from your experience and learn from you. And today there is an education specialist at HEAL, which is a Stanford Medicine Children's Hospital amazing initiative, and she'll tell us a little bit more about this before we start getting into the questions. But let's start with hearing a little bit more about Bridge Lab. And Dr. Green, I'll kick it off to you.
So I'm going to be brief. Bridge Lab is located at Stanford. You can see in the picture some of our group members. We are interested in understanding how the brain is structured and how it's function in children with RASopathies, meaning we mostly now focus on Noonan syndrome and NF1. And the kind of like underlying premise is that understanding how the brain is working differently can help us understand other weaknesses that children with RASopathies experience, like social communication challenges, irritability, regulation of mood. So, and also on a more broader concept is, we also believe that children with these syndromes can help us understand the brain in general and how it's affected by different genetic changes. So this is the Bridge Lab, and more specifically about the studies that we're currently having and need participants for. So if you a parent of a child with Noonan syndrome or NF1 between the age 5 to 13, we really welcome you to come. I think it's a great experience for the children. The children also they go through an MRI. Some kids for some kids it's challenging, but for most of them it's a exciting experience. And other than that, we also conducting very thorough neurocognitive assessment, which is a research assessment, but can give the parents a lot of clues about what's going on in terms of learning and other aspects of behavior. And we also are able, fortunately, thanks to our funding, able to cover the cost of the travel here. So we love to, if you reach out and come visit us.
Thank you, Dr. Green. And we do also want to hear a little bit about HEAL. We would love to hear from you.
Well, the HEAL program was started probably about 15 years ago. We realized that even though kids were, undergoing treatments, or when they were through with their treatments, or they had conditions that carried on beyond the hospital stay and that kind of thing, that families were having trouble reintegrating back into their home schools. So the HEAL program was started, and we work with families to make sure that IEPs and 504s and whatever else is needed in place to ensure that their children have equal access to education. So right now we reach out to families, and any family that is being served or has been served at Lucille Packard, Stanford, is eligible for our services, and they're free. But if, after this meeting, if you're from another state or have questions, I'm happy to answer any of them. So I've put my contact in the chat line.
Thank you. And we will share your information and also all the slides and all the information shared here with everyone following the session.
Great.
So let's get started with the Q&A. Again, all of these questions were sourced directly from you. So thank you again for sending them, and we'll get started. So our first question is, I'm about to sit down from my first IEP meeting, and I'm feeling quite nervous. I want to be prepared. Any suggestions? And there, I'll hand it over to you to answer.
Okay, absolutely. The first thing to know is that you know your child the best. So you are the one who is the best prepared to present what is needed. Schools, it can be really intimidating. They're like 8 or 10 people sitting around a table, and they've all done testing on your child or seen your child in the classroom, and all have their own opinions. But know that you as a parent are a really important part of this team. So, make sure that you speak up when you need to and don't feel intimidated. So my best suggestion is introduce yourself, introduce your child in your own words, and say, I really need help in making sure that my child can get a good education.
And I will jump in and an advice Thayer gave me when I consulted with her about kids that I am taking care of is to come with an advocate, or come with someone to the meeting. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. It's my job at HEAL. I go to every IEP for my families or 504 meeting. It's really nice to have somebody with you. If they know your child, that's really helpful. But even not, it gives you someone that can take notes and listen, because you're really concentrating on what's being said and that kind of thing, and you're not able to process everything at once. So it's great to have an advocate. If you have a husband or a wife or whoever, good friend, it really doesn't matter. But Naomi's right. We need to have somebody there that's going to support you and make sure they hear what's being said.
Yes, and I will just add that as an immigrant, if English is not your first language, please make sure you come with someone who is fluent in English and can help you, because the anxiety and your second languageism can be really difficult to navigate on those meetings that use a lot of professional terms. And so that would be my advice too.
Great advice.
And I think this is almost a follow-up question. In order to get an IEP and to qualify for an IEP, does a child have to be failing? Does a medical diagnosis ultimately qualify a child with NF, for example, for an IEP?
A medical diagnosis alone does not qualify a child for an IEP. It has to be interfering with their ability to access the general education. So, if your child is, prone to memory loss or ADHD or has behavior issues or anything that's impacting their ability to attend class and be present to learn, then they qualify for an IEP. The big general term that is used is OHI, or other health impaired. And when you are initially asking for an assessment, make sure you include your child's diagnosis. It can be a simple note as, my child has been diagnosed with whatever. I want him or her assessed to make sure that educationally she is or he is able to access the curriculum. But, a medical diagnosis alone is not enough, but in probably 95% of the cases, the medical diagnosis is causing something else to happen, whether it be a behavior thing, a brain, like with epilepsy, that, is flickering in and out. So that does impair a child's ability to attend.
Thank you. And we'll go on to the next question. My 3-year-old got a diagnosis recently. When should my child be evaluated? What are the major indicators that my child should be evaluated for? And Dr. Green, I'll hand it over to you.
So when I'm answering that, I'm assuming when the parent says that the child got a diagnosis, it's a diagnosis of genetic condition, but feel free to correct me later on when we open the Q&A. So I think if a child has a diagnosis of RASopathy or another genetic diagnosis of what we consider large effect, so that we know it has an effect on organs in the body, I think at 3-year-old going to be a good time to assess them for the first time. And usually the address to that would be the first person would be the pediatrician, but I think parents should try to reach developmental peds or any professional that can assess development in that age. And what major indicators might be? It's a really challenging thing to do. So I would say that we have these like benchmarks of expectations at 3-year-old. I can name some of them. So it would be speaking in sentences, being independent in feeding yourself. Those are like really gross benchmarks that if the child does not meet them, any health professional that will see them will kind of like know that further evaluation is needed. There are more subtle indicators that can trigger that. And I think there it would be, that's the reason I would recommend go beyond the primary care pediatrician and have someone that has more skills to evaluate. I hope it's answered.
And by law, when a child is 3 years old, the school district in which you reside, if you feel that there is a deficit, you go to your school district and you say, I want my child assessed for special needs. And the districts federally across the country are required to do an assessment on your child for educational readiness. And if they qualify, then they will be placed in a preschool classroom that will meet their needs at no cost. So, a federal law, up until age 3, it's regionally centered and developmental, different agencies. But a 3-year-old can go to any school district and say, I have a 3-year-old with this diagnosis. I want them assessed and placed in a program.
And I know, Thayer, that you are based in California, but this applies to
Across the country. It's a federal law.
we will move on to the next question. I think it is kind of it relates to our last one. I'm always thinking that some of my child's academic difficulties stem from NF1. How do we differentiate between developmentally appropriate difficulties versus always thinking, is this difficulty caused by having NF1? And in addition to that, what are the most commonly seen issues with NF1 children?
So I'm gonna tackle that from different angles, this question. And I think one of the biggest challenges is once we know we have a child with genetic condition, it's kind of like we have like these lenses and we never, I think the person who asked the question really described that really, really well. And I think this is where research is also really important, because what we do, we take kids that do have NF1 and compare them to typically developing kids, and then we can kind of like isolate what are the commonly weaknesses or challenges that kids with NF1 are dealing with. And I'm jumping to the second question now, just to say, what are they? And it's going to be true for NF1 and Noonan syndrome, is that the challenges that we see is challenges with attention and tendency to overactivation in terms of like hyperactivity or impulsivity. We see learning difficulties that can manifest as learning disabilities, or even a more gross effect on cognition. And we also see issues with social communication and interpretation of subtle social cues. How do you differentiate? It's a very challenging question that basically this is like what we do in assessment, or and I would say that the really good way to do that is not to try to do it yourself. Get a lot of information from multiple domains. So if the child visits school, talk with the teacher and talk with if there's a special resource teacher, get their feedback about, because they've seen like a lot of kids, so they usually know to say, hey, this is like beyond normal variants of development. Grandparents who already raised a lot of kids and they kind of have an eye for that. Other after school activities, the child is there. So get feedback on your child from multiple domains. I think it can help.
Great. I see Thayer nodding here in agreement.
Yeah, no, that's great information. And really know that, after age 3, your school district is there to support you. So make sure that you reach out to them and say, I need help. I need my child assessed, because that's a really good starting place and one that is free of cost. So, it's available to anyone.
And going into the specifics of the assessment.
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I'm sure the psych tests, there are obviously ones that work very closely in diagnosing verbal recall and memory and all those kinds of things. And again, your district child, the school psychologist will have the educational tests that can test these deficits. But for anything that's, more neurocognitive, you need to go back to your pediatrician and get that done through the healthcare system.
Okay, thank you. And go to the next question. Do you have any suggestions for getting IEP teams to really consider the systemic impact of Noonan syndrome or other RASopathies in creating goals and the services that they drive? And Dr. Green, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, we all thought that this is a really important question, and one that triggered us to think of and discuss that. So while in a like utopic world, your educational system personnel will know everything about Noonan syndrome or about F1. Of course, because these syndromes are rare, and for some teachers, it's going to be the first time they ever heard about it. So I would say that educating the educational system is on us. And I think when I was younger, I used to send teachers like this scientific paper that describe everything about Noonan syndrome. And of course, as a teacher with like 30 students, I don't think anyone is sitting there and reading that. So being older and wiser, I would advise to think about a way that communicates the effect of Noonan syndrome on different on cognition and behavior, but also on different systems in the body, even explaining why the child is like shorter compared to his peers or have other manifestations. And I also would recommend to do that like visually with a diagram that with like arrows. And I tried to find for this webinar something that we did, but Thayer said it's too complicated. So we're definitely thinking about how to communicate that. And I think this is something that we would love to work on with a parent who is like motivated and has the skills to we can provide the scientific evidence, and a parent can provide the an easy way to describe that.
So part of my job is to attend IEP meetings and 504 meetings with families, and I'm often asked to describe a syndrome or a disease and what the cognitive effects might be. And I make it as simple as possible. If a parent is comfortable with it, I use very personal things like, for instance, my child can't do PE because there are heart complications. And if he gets too overactive, then that may cause things to happen. So I try to present in very simple terms what the syndrome is so that the team is aware of it. And then to say, in this particular case, these are the things that we are seeing at this point. And then I can also say, and these are the things we need to watch out for. So, be sure you're comfortable in sharing that information. As educators, obviously, we know the cognitive effects of chemo brain, for instance, if your child has received chemotherapy. But when we have all these new syndromes and things that are out there, it's very difficult for the educational system to keep up. So, get some help in doing a short and concise presentation on what it is and how it affects your child. And then we can move on to create goals that will meet specific needs.
And I think I just want to, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I just wanted to jump in with like several resources that I forgot to mention, and I think they're like those are really important. The RASopathy Network, the CTF, Noonan Foundation, all of them have materials that's been developed for education. So I would highly encourage the parents to visit those resources before the meeting at school and see if they can just pull something out that is simple and clear.
And I see some links being shared in the chat, and that's great. And we will follow up with the links at the end and share anything that's mentioned here or shared in the chat.
The thing to know is that the more information you can give the team prior to your meeting, the better, because then people come into the meeting all in the same place.
And we'll move to the next question. And I see there are some questions in the chat. And again, we'll go back to them shortly, and you'll have the chance to ask them yourself. As a parent, it's extremely difficult to ensure an IEP is helpful, functional, and is being measured. Do you have any advice?
Absolutely. You know your child the best. And an IEP is a fluid document. So even if you sign an IEP on a Friday and you think of something next Monday, you are entitled as part of that team to call another meeting. So if in the first couple of months, you don't think there's progress being made or something that has come up that doesn't seem right, call a meeting and say, this isn't working. How can you help me change it? And, schools are less than competent, let's say, in making sure that all the kids in their school, I mean, I know we all want the best for our children and for the kids that we're serving. But when you have, a new teacher with 35 kids and she has this kid in the classroom that's being incredibly disruptive and stuff, she may have read the IEP on the first day of school, but 2 weeks into it, she's forgotten 2/3 of what's in there. So, a good thing to do is to make sure you're very involved with your classroom teachers and ask them, how is it going? And ask them for a report on a regular basis. You can ask for it as much as weekly. So, just be a very active part of that team, because again, you know your child the best and you are the one who drives this whole process.
And another question regarding kind of keeping track and making sure IEPs are going well. What do you do when things go wrong with the implementation? Can you give some guidance on what to do if my kid is not making meaningful progress? Goals aren't being appropriately ambitious and schools are not providing services.
Again, I go back to be part of the team. And if you don't like something, speak out. And again, kids interact with teachers on a different basis. It may be as simple as moving your child's teacher or asking for a different resource support. Ask your child what's making it hard. Do they, kids don't have to like all their teachers, obviously, but if there's a conflict going on, and if your child is not wanting to go for services, either to the, speech and language or for OT or PT, and there's a disconnect between the instructor and the child, that's something that you have a right to say, I need to change it. We need to look further. We need to have people in place that are going to support my child. So, again, I can't stress enough, you're in charge of this IEP. The school writes it, you have to sign it. So if there's something you don't like, then speak out. And again, bring an advocate with you so somebody else is hearing the same things that you are, and you can go back and forth and say, did they really say that or whatever. One thing I would suggest to families is that you ask to have the meeting taped or recorded. That's your right. And that way you can take it back and re-listen to it that evening. Nothing should be signed the day of a meeting. You should always go home, read it over, listen to the recording, and then come back and sign it or not sign it, depending on what you want.
And I will jump in. Sometimes situations like that, then when a parent and a school really kind of like collide, are a situation that I see clinically that there's some challenge that not being addressed. Sometimes, for example, severe attention problem, or the child is very disruptive, and there's kind of like starts a cycle of difficulties with the child and difficulties between the child and the parent and the team. So sometimes when things doesn't go well, it's not necessarily someone's specific fault. It might be that the needs are not being addressed as they should be. So just kind of like, not sure it's the situation, but just keep it in mind that it's also can kind of be an indicator that something is going on, that we are having some blind spot too.
And it's always nice to start off any kind of meeting in a positive, like, I don't want to complain, but I have a feeling something's not working. How can I help you? In schools, you know, obviously they get on the defensive if you come at them. But in general, if you work as a team, it works better.
Like there are some very actionable tips here in terms of recording a meeting, in terms of having an advocate present, in terms of not signing anything the day of, and then some more subtle tips. Thank you. And let's tackle this one. What do you do when your child would benefit from repeating the grades, but the school refuses? And there, I'll let you take this.
There are very few instances where repeating a grade is going to make a whole lot of difference. You know, like holding a child back, entering kindergarten and starting them at, you know, 6 and moving forward is one thing. Districts are very much mindset against retention. So a way to sort of work around this is to see if they do combo classes. Is there a 2nd, 3rd grade where they can be in that class for 2 years, or moving forward with, you know, another teacher? But the school can refuse to allow you to repeat, but you can transfer your child within a district or ask for inter-district transfer if you feel strongly, both emotionally or educationally or whatever, that repeating a year would be a good idea. You can request that and get, again, the IEP needs to be written that way, but you have some rights as a parent. But it's getting more and more difficult to get this to be allowed.
And Thayer, can I follow up with a question? How do you see it professionally from special education perspective? What is kind of like the consideration?
You know, with most of my special ed kids, I prefer to start them later, give them the extra year of pre-K, pre-kindergarten, because that way they have a jump start, another year, in an educational setting, but not necessarily a graded setting. A lot of these kids have issues with social issues and interactions and learning how to work together, talk with their peers, that kind of thing. So, you know, that is a good place to start if you're okay with that, is doing that pre-K class. I don't think there's particularly a benefit in repeating a grade, because as a child is under an IEP, they can stay in school till they're age 21. So, you know, your child doesn't have to finish high school in the, you know, those designated years. They can stay on. So usually the peer benefit of being pulled back is psychologically really tough on a child, especially if they have a peer community, because then it's just one more thing I failed at. So my suggestion is not to do that, to do it at the front end, which is just fine. And then just to realize, okay, we may get to our senior year and we may be credits or whatever short, but we can make that up, you know, in the next 2 or 3 years till we turn 21.
And I join you in the front end, like if a child is not mature enough or there are difficulties or can benefit from just learning the environment and the instructions, I don't see any harm in that, usually only benefits. So I join that recommendation.
And I think that goes back to an earlier point where at 3 years old, you are able to ask for an evaluation. So you are able to know and maybe formally know earlier on.
Right. And that in the school district, at that point, will put your child in a preschool class, and they may suggest, let's not put him in kindergarten. Let's have him do another year of preschool. And again, that's at the district's expense. And so it doesn't, you know, it doesn't financially burden any family.
Thank you. And we have a few more questions that were asked ahead of time, and we'll get through them. But in the meantime, feel free to start asking your additional questions in the chat if they come up. All right. Can you discuss confidence and how it affects RAS child's ability to succeed in school? For example, when and why do children with RASopathies or with other diagnoses start to notice that they are different? And Dr. Green, I'll kick it off.
So I'm like strongly believe that first of all, kids with RASopathies are, for the most part, function in the normal range of cognition, which means they are very aware to their environment, very aware to their peers, and very aware of any differences. And I can say that in the clinic, as early as 4 or 5 kids already know that something is different. And I would say it's, of course, very personal decision. And it's a very personal decision about what to say and when to say. And I would suggest parents to share as much they feel comfortable to share. But I would lean towards sharing with the child and educating them and talking about it rather than not, because I do believe that most kids know that something is different. And so the earlier, the more kind of like normalized it is, this conversation. And I think there's a lot of value of spiral conversation. So you can have a conversation at the age of 3, and then later on, and this conversation going to change each time the child is in a different developmental stage. So it's not one conversation, it's definitely an ongoing one. And for families with children with Noonan syndrome, there's a wonderful, simple book that Dr. Rini Pierpont published, and I think it's available on Amazon. So that can be also a way to share with your child.
Thank you. And we will share the name of the book afterwards as well, in case anyone's frantically trying to look it up now. Okay, there. Question for you. How does homeschooling work with an IEP, specifically if a child needs occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy?
Okay, so I am assuming this question means homeschooling and not home teaching. Home teaching is what is provided by a school district when a child, for whatever reason, can't attend school. And that means the school district is responsible for sending a teacher and providing the academics. Homeschooling is an independent decision where usually the parent is providing the instruction. And if your child has an IEP for a variety of reasons, and if you've decided that homeschooling is the best, then you can still get the OT, the PT, the speech support from your home school district. The difficulty is in many areas, there is not a resource of a lot of support. They may not have an OT or PT person that's available for kids outside of the school. But legally, the school district is still responsible for anything that has been covered in an IEP to be supplied, even if you have decided that the instruction part of the education is going to be done by you or your family. So, again, you need to work really closely with the school district to make sure that OT, PT, speech, whatever else is needed is available at the school district. You probably will need to transport your child from home to the school to get those services. They're not going to send them out to you. So that's another detriment to the homeschooling versus home teaching. Homeschool. Home hospital is what most school districts call it.
I would add to that I think many families with children with IEP really were significantly affected by the COVID pandemic. But I do think that the silver lining there is that schools became more open to provide these services for if you transport your child or if you drop them off, or kind of working with you on a schedule that is reasonable. And from the child psych perspective, I would strongly advocate, don't lose this window of development. Speech therapy, PT, OT, those things are crucial at the early developmental stages of a child and can affect significantly their confidence and their ability to learn. So I would strongly advocate to not doing your best to get them if your child is eligible.
Thank you.
And again, if anybody has any questions about homeschooling versus home hospital teaching from the district, I'm happy to answer those at another time.
Thank you. And we have another question here. Is there or will there ever be a public genetic database to look up common characteristics and symptoms of specific genetic mutations?
There is actually one like that. It's very geared towards physicians. So I think if parents are accessing that, and I'm going to share the link, but with the caveat of kind of like the things that you can see there is things that are, for us from the medical system, we're very, very geared towards pathology. So kind of you have to keep that in mind when you look it up. But it is a good resource to type the name of the genetic mutation and see what has been associated with that if you're interested. But very, very medically geared one.
Right, thank you. And then I believe we have one last question here, and we've discussed this throughout. The question is, are there any resources you recommend for parent advocacy? And we've discussed multiple. We do have a slide here, and there I'll let you speak to it, of some resources that you've recommended.
Sure. These are, there are usually helping parent groups in each state that can be an advocate for you or help you through the IEP process or whatever. And these other two are also, very informational. I think that the most important thing is to remember that every school district special ed department, which is probably what you're all dealing with, is required by law to have a list of resources for parents. They don't readily share that, but it is available and you can ask. So just, it's kind of like the sticky wheel gets the grease. If you ask